Kristen Turner, British High Commissioner to Pakistan, to also join us up on stage. We will now officially begin with our keynote speaker, Dr. Megan O'Sullivan. Dr. Megan O'Sullivan is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and the Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at Harvard University's Kennedy School. She was previously the Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan and is currently a member of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Foreign Policy Advisory Board. I'd like to know if Dr. Megan is online with us currently.
Yes, I am, and I'm happy to begin. Good.
Hello, Dr. Megan. I hope we are audible to you.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Could you kindly speak again?
I'm online. I'm ready to begin. Can you hear me okay? Hello? Wonderful. Okay. If I could just get confirmation from the room that you can hear me.
नहीं बनना
I'd like to begin, but I do not see, I see that I am still muted on your.
We are able to hear you, ma'am.
Dimitri and Belina, you can hear me okay?
I can, Megan.
Okay. I am trying to.
I can also hear you very well, but I think that right now we are in this awkward situation that we are locked in the Zoom and no one else.
Actually, we are able to hear you just right, Miss Megan.
That is a good way of describing it. I'm WhatsApping with one of the organizers, so hopefully it will be remedied.
And I want to excuse myself that I have another appointment in exactly 1 hour, so it's not personal. It's not personal. I would like to stay till the very end, but I really need to go.
I'm the same way. I'm teaching a little bit. I've been told that we can be heard now, and if I could just get some confirmation, I'd be happy to begin.
Dr. Megan, we are able to hear you. You've been audible throughout. Dr. Megan, if you could kindly begin with your keynote address.
Okay, so you can hear me now?
You're audible.
Wonderful. Okay. Good afternoon. We have been in our own little Zoom world, but we're happy to be with you again. That is other panelists and myself. So I'd like to begin by saying good afternoon, good evening, and from my perspective, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with the Islamabad Research Institute and joining you for the Margala Dialogue. I know this is a very important forum for Pakistan, and I'm honored to be part of it. I'd like to acknowledge Moeed Yusuf, who is someone who I know is very important to Pakistan in terms of its national security and domestic politics. But Moeed and I have a relationship that goes back to his student days in the United States, where he actually was someone who was very instrumental in my transition from the Bush White House into academia at Harvard. So I'd like to thank him for helping me all those years ago, and it's good to be with him even virtually. So from where I sit, and that is in Boston, Massachusetts right now, one might feel that over the last week, the world has returned a little bit to a sense of normalcy. We've seen, by all accounts, a productive summit between President Xi and Biden in Bali. We've seen the G20 meeting to discuss very important global issues like food security and the international economy. And we've seen, dozens and dozens of nations come together in Sharm el-Sheikh to continue the pursuit of a cooperative solution to the problem of climate change, which is something that Pakistan has played a very important leadership role. So even from the U.S. perspective, you could sit here and say in the last week that our elections were more normal than many people expected, where for the first time in some time, it's the centrists rather than the political extremes that have seemed to do the best here. But I would say even with that snapshot of just the last week, the reality is quite different, that we are moving into a world that is very different from the world that we lived in even 10 years ago. And I would say that there are a range of structural factors that mean that we are heading into waters that are going to be a significant departure from where the United States and its friends and allies and adversaries have been for the last several decades. Now, I certainly won't claim that there ever was a global order that was all-inclusive, applied evenly and effectively across the world. But I do think it's fair to say that the world over the decades, really since the end of World War II, was characterized by a few things that really were enduring for a long period of time. And those are functioning international institutions, open markets and comparatively free flows of trade, investment, and people, the domination of the liberal democratic model, and hyperglobalization, which was both economic and political in nature. And again, this wasn't uniform, but these were significant and enduring characteristics of the system. And as I said, we're now in a very different space, which is defined by a number of different trends. We don't see a complete break from the past, but I would say we are seeing a gradual, and in some cases, accelerated departure. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on three of those forces, which I think are most consequential and are clearly very important for Pakistan as well. And that is great power competition, deglobalization, and the rise of state power. So beginning with great power competition, this is the obvious place to begin because this is where I would say we see the most evident and radical departure from previous decades. It's one of the biggest reversals of the post-Cold War order that, despite the fact for decades the world enjoyed a respite from great power conflict, we're now in a place which I would say has really reemerged in the last 7 years or so, where a conflict between the US and China is a legitimate concern. And some might even argue that the US and Russia are in somewhat of an active proxy war today. So in many respects, great power conflict is front and center and is the dominant characteristic of this era in global politics. In some ways, this great power conflict is really an outgrowth of the success of the last order. We saw this network and this globalization, the hyperglobalization, lead to the rise in other powers. China may have been the biggest beneficiary of this global order, bringing hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty and allowing China to establish itself on the world stage in a way that might have been inconceivable under a different kind of order. In terms of Russia, Russia's become a source of instability and security rivalry, not so much as a consequence of its success in the last global order, but maybe the opposite. Maybe there is a sense of a closing window for Russia to reestablish some important objectives like a greater Russia or a change in the European security landscape. And I know that we have the pleasure of hearing from Dmitry Trenin, who will give us some Russian perspective there. But whatever the causes, the rivalry, competition, and possible conflict among great powers is really transforming this landscape. And I'd say the US-China relationship is perhaps the most consequential, not just for Americans and Chinese, but really for the world. And the consequences of a hot or active conflict obviously would be devastating for those well beyond those two countries' borders. But even if a conflict, say over Taiwan, is able to be avoided, the tensions in this great power relationship are transforming the global landscape. And that gets me to this point in the great power rivalry about the decoupling of the US and China. And I know this is something of serious concern to Pakistan. Now, there's some debate over whether this decoupling will occur, but I would just say it is already occurring. And the debate is not so much whether it's going to occur, it is how transformative it's going to be, how widespread it's going to be. Already the US and China have decided, both of them, that neither can tolerate interdependency in some sectors. And this is in the high-tech sector, and we've seen a lot of evidence of this. So the decoupling is already happening in that area. And the question is, can the US and China work together to define the sectors where interdependency is not tolerable and therefore decoupling is inevitable, where they can create guardrails around the competition that is going to result from the decoupling of these sectors, and whether they can encourage continued cooperation and integration in other areas that don't seem to infringe on their national security. This is what I would call selective decoupling, and this is in the better interest of the world and the global economy, and it's contrasted to what I might call instinctive decoupling, which is certainly a possibility, but not inevitable. But this decoupling is not going to stand alone. There's going to be decoupling and then recoupling with other partners. And I would say that neither China nor the US is going to seek to be self-sufficient, but is going to look to other partners. And this concept, which is very, very prominent in the United States, of friendshoring, I think is going to be one of those dominant trends of the coming era. So this leads quite naturally into the second phenomenon I want to discuss about shaping this new global order, and that is of deglobalization. Now, the conversation around deglobalization is also quite confusing. What it is not a diminution of global forces or global challenges. And in fact, I think we can probably all agree that the world is facing an acceleration and an intensification of global problems. And this could be seen in the pandemic, in the wide-ranging effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and as Pakistan knows better than any other country right now, the effects of climate change, the costs of which are being borne by those who may be the least responsible for it. So there is a growing, there's an increase in global challenges, but what there is a decrease in is the ability to manage those through global governance. And again, we just look at the role of the WHO in the pandemic, which was definitely subpar. The role of the G20 during the economic crisis that the world is headed towards has been very underwhelming. And climate change, despite the continuation of the Conference of the Parties like we're seeing in Sharm el-Sheikh, we still know the world is falling dramatically short of where it needs to be. And part of the reason we have this phenomenon of growing global challenges but decreased capacity to deal with them through global governance is because of this great power competition. The deglobalization also has an economic side as well as the political side that I just discussed. The deglobalization is not only being driven by the US-China relationship and its deterioration, but it's being driven by a broader, more general dissatisfaction, a backlash against globalization, and the inability of many governments, including my own, to really manage the downsides of globalization. And therefore, we see an increase in inequality, which has fueled more nationalism, more populism, and therefore more protectionism. And that, I think, is something that is bound to continue. And just speaking from the US perspective, if you look at the latest, the new Biden national security strategy, which was released about 2 weeks ago, US governments here are mandated by Congress to put out a national security strategy about once a term. It states very clearly that the age of big trade agreements are pretty much over from the perspective of the United States. There just isn't global or really national support for market access trade agreements that have been so consequential in the past. There's one last point I'd like to make before leaving the globalization and closing out with the last trend that I see as being really important in this new era. And on globalization, I would say there is a trend that is reinforcing globalization, and that is the trend of increasing effects of climate change and the ever-increasing pressures to decarbonize. And as the world decarbonizes its energy sector, this will be deglobalizing. As more countries become more self-sufficient, there'll be less dependence on energy-related trade. The International Energy Agency looks out to 2050 and the potential for a net zero world. And they say that energy trade will only be 1/3 of what it would be if we stayed on the current trajectory. So there'll be less trade, there'll be more electrification of economies, and that tends to be much more domestic, perhaps regional, but definitely not international. And finally, the pursuit of decarbonization is going to lead to more protectionism. This is not ideal, but in some ways it's a consequence of global politics. And again, I can point to my own country. In the United States, there's a lot of celebration of what we're calling the Inflation Reduction Act, which has $400 billion for climate-related measures. This is an effort to try to get to where we need to be on climate, not by pricing the cost of carbon, but by incentivizing sectors, industries, and others to actually embrace these goals. And while we celebrate it here, a lot of countries around the world are looking at this as just another form of protectionism. So let me just conclude with the third trend that I see as being very consequential in this global order as it is reemerging, and that is the rise of the state. And this is quite the opposite of what many were predicting in the 1990s. What we heard about so often after the end of the Cold War is how this was going to be an era of non-state actors and supranational actors. But instead, we see a very clear growing power of the state. And in some ways, this is the obvious correlation to weakening globalization, where restrictions were lifted on the free flow of people, ideas, and goods. Now we're moving in the other direction when it comes to globalization, and that results in empowering the state, or the state needs to be empowered to do that. It's also, the rise of the state is clearly a response to COVID, where in many parts of the world, people at the end of the day look to their governments to provide solutions. So now we have more dominant states in many respects. And this is a phenomenon that we can see all over the world. Certainly that's one of the big takeaways from the China and the October Party Congress. We look at India, we can look at Turkey, Mexico, the European Union emerging stronger as it grapples with the challenge of energy security. And even in the United States, the trend is for more power to the government and more government intervention. And finally, I would say, just like the deglobalization phenomenon, this phenomenon of the rising power of the state is going to be accelerated by climate change and the effort to decarbonize the agenda. It's very clear at this point that the market alone doesn't deliver energy security. It's also very clear that the market alone is not going to deliver climate security. And so we already see in the Inflation Reduction Act, as I mentioned, but in many other pieces of legislation or executive orders around the world, that the state is growing more and more powerful as countries struggle with a range of challenges which are not being addressed adequately at the global level. So in closing, I would say, what does this all mean for Pakistan? Obviously, this is the pursuit of the day is to talk about this. I would say, just for a few thoughts to leave you with for the rest of the day, this means that Pakistan has a much more complex landscape to navigate, as is the case for many countries. There are obviously going to be significant implications for Pakistan's growth strategy, as well as for its foreign policy. And it will need to continue with the imperative of balancing its relationships, which is something that has been a focal point for Pakistan going forward. And if anything, this is going to become more imperative and more critical to its success. So with that, I'd like to close my comments. I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers. I apologize that I won't be able to stay for the whole forum. My teaching obligations at Harvard require me to go offline in the reasonably near future, but I wish you a very fruitful couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Megan, for providing us with the ground for the discourse that we will be having. She pointed out three interesting trends, and of course they're quite apparent too with her expanding on them. First being that of the great power competition that we're witnessing between the US and China, and the other being deglobalization, and then of course the last one, rise of the state. That allows us enough meat to further comment on this, and with that being said, I would like to call upon our first panelist for the discourse, His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Christian Turner. He is the British High Commissioner to Pakistan. He was the Prime Minister's International Affairs Advisor and Deputy National Security Advisor from April 2017 to July 2019. He previously served as the Director General, Political and Director General for the Middle East and Africa. Sir, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Very nice to be with you all back at the Margala Dialogue 22, and I would just like to thank the organisers at IPRI IPRI, who have done a fantastic job once again of bringing us together in what I agree is a really important conversation for the community here in Islamabad and worldwide. And one of the great pleasures of following someone as distinguished as Dr. Megan Sullivan is that she's done a very good job of setting out the big picture on the strategic challenges we face. I suspect there is not much disagreement in the room to the core proposition that the world in which we are living and operating and navigating has fundamentally changed in probably the last 3 to 5 years. Certainly the 3 years of my tour to Islamabad, I've been here for almost exactly 3 years now. I think the landscape has changed quite rapidly. In particular, we have had 2 significant global events, the coronavirus pandemic and the Ukraine war, which have really changed, I think, the context in which we operate. I would propose that although they haven't added new trends, and Dr. Megan listed 3, they've accelerated pre-existing trends. And as a practitioner, that gives us quite a lot of a challenge. And to jump to my punchline, I would agree with Minister of State Hina Rabbani Kar in her keynote earlier when she said, "Don't give up on interdependence." My working life is all about interdependence, what I call UK Pakidosti, Hum Ek Saath Hain, the interconnection between the UK and Pakistan. But I think we should recognize that we live in an era of more disorderly interdependence. Disorderly interdependence, I think, is the best phrase I could find for these trends that are shifting the paradigm in the face of coronavirus and the Ukraine war. I won't repeat the areas that Dr. Megan has listed. I actually agree with all of them. There are others I could talk about. I don't think we've yet discussed what I would call a 5th dimension or grey zone conflict, the fact that most conflict now is not fought on the battlefield between professional soldiers. It's hybrid, it's in different areas, it's using economic warfare, lawfare, misinformation campaigns, and as national security practitioners, we've got to be literate in all of those areas, not just one of those spheres. For governments that like to operate in silos, that is quite a challenge. I think we should also talk about technological advances and the way in which tech is transforming the global nature of work and foreign policy. Who regulates internationally the role of Twitter, the role of Meta, the role of Google, and how that is disrupting most sectors and the nature of work, as I say, giving a massive competitive advantage to those who can keep pace with change. I would also agree, the President and I were just talking about what it means for us as practitioners, and Dr. Kissinger in his latest book, 99 years on, he's still going strong, talks about one of the great challenges for those of us in government, that it seems as though the time in which to take strategic decisions is rapidly shortening. You will hear much wiser words from Bruno shortly on the situation in Ukraine, but he was asking my view on last night's news of missile attacks in Poland, a very troubling development. My honest answer is we're only 12 hours into this news and I'm still struggling to work out what's going on, but that's the sort of world we're in. The speed of decision making actually makes forums like this all the more important. Dr. Megan touched on environmental stresses, obviously a massive issue that has driven to the forefront of the agenda here in Pakistan with the floods. I would add simply one statistic that 70% of Pakistan's GDP is reliant on agriculture, and most predictions have the Indus River Basin losing about 1/4 of its available water in the next 20 years. That brings a really stark sense of the kind of challenges a country like Pakistan faces, even if we manage to get through the floods recovery. The final one I would put on the list is something I don't think we talk about enough, which is demographics. Demographics and population growth. And we had yesterday, I think overnight, the news of the 8 billionth human being being born on the planet. When I was born, sorry to say it was 1972, there were 3 and a bit billion people on the face of the planet. When I reached 40, there were 7, there are now 8. The speed of that curve, most of our lifetimes. And I think as foreign policy practitioners, we don't talk enough about that demographic challenge. I'll come back to it in terms of the number of jobs you need to create for a young population, what that does to migration and population movement. So I could carry on. You will have things to add. Other speakers, I'm sure, will add to it. But the list of issues which we face in this complex world of disorderly interdependence, I think we can agree is changing the paradigm. And I agree with Dr. Sullivan that the global governance that has served us well since the Second World War is now feeling like it is not up to the challenge of navigating in a cooperative world rather than a confrontational one, the stresses and the strains. So having set that out, there's much more we could talk about in that, and I hope we can get into it in the question and answer with the panel. Let me do 2 things. One is bring that to Pakistan and say a little bit about what I think it means for the British relationship with Pakistan, which after all is my day job here. And then I have 3 proposals for Pakistan policymakers and academics on where I think that could take the country's international policy. So for the UK, as I said, I think the UK relationship with Pakistan is non-discretionary. I was just saying to Bruno that my embassy is the second largest British embassy in the world. That's testament to the breadth of the relationship here still. But for most of the last 20 years, if you'd had a British High Commissioner standing here, they would have said their relationship rests on 4 broad areas. And my point is that 3 of those 4 areas, I think, have fundamentally changed in my time as High Commissioner. The first is security and counterterrorism and what was called the war on terror, giving Pakistan's proximity to Pakistan. And of course, with the Allies' departure from Kabul and the takeover of the Taliban, that looks very, very different now to what it did in 2019. The interest of our counterterrorism work has also, I think, radically altered, still a major challenge. But if I was advising the British Prime Minister today, as I advised the last British Prime Minister, and I was going through what I thought were the top 5 national security challenges for the British state, counterterrorism would not be on the list. Would not be on the list. And most of us in this room have developed our careers at a time when talking about a terrorist threat was pretty much central, certainly for my career, working through the Middle East and Africa, as you heard, was central to what I did and what I thought about that blend of governance, failed states, security, and intelligence. That is no longer at the center of gravity, I think, for challenges that governments face. That is a massive shift, and it means that Pakistan can no longer play a sort of automatic counterterrorism card and expect that to be getting attention in capitals around the world. We can talk more about the situation in Afghanistan today. Actually, I would observe that Pakistan and its interests are very closely aligned with those of the global community, whether that's China, Russia, the Europeans, or the US. We're all actually saying we want the same things. We want stability. We don't want a massive outflow of people. We want safe passage for those who want to leave. We want humanitarian assistance for those who need it, and we want an inclusive society, including for women and girls, and particularly secondary girls, to be able to be educated. I hear very much the same list from everyone I talk to. And on engagement, I should say the British government was one of the first Western governments to be in Kabul talking to the Taliban. So I very much agree with Minister of State Carr that we need to engage and have that conversation. So Pakistan is still a key partner in Afghanistan, but it's at a different place in the agenda. The second area of policy that my predecessors would have said was massive and deep and fundamental for the UK-Pakistan relationship is development. And for a long time, my mission ran the British government's largest development program in the world, at one point spending over £250 million British pounds a year on its bilateral programs and more elsewhere. That is no longer the case, and that's for 2 reasons. The first, is that Pakistan has been a success story, and it has reached middle income status. And the kind of assistance we did, building schools and helping with health in areas of poverty in, say, Punjab, absolute gold standard for our development work, that's no longer necessary. It's much more targeted. It's much more about technical assistance, for example, helping with tax and the economy. It's a very different kind of development, and that's a good news story because of the success we've had. But it's also different because, say it's not too loud, most Western governments have far less money to spend on aid than they did. The British government had a legal commitment to spend 0.7% of its GDP, one of the only very few countries in the world to make that commitment on aid. Given the depth of our post-pandemic recession, that was moved to 0.5%, and there will be a budget in the UK announced tomorrow. To give you a sense of the scale of the challenge, historically Britain used to spend about £40 billion a year on energy, £40 billion. It's projected in the next year to spend £180 billion on energy. That's about 10% of our GDP. So countries like mine are facing deep, deep economic challenges, as we all are, and the amount of money available for development is just less, and that's very pertinent to the situation with the floods. So first area of our policy was Afghanistan, terrorism, changed. The second was development, changed. The third was a sense of a balance with India. And for a long time, if a US Secretary of State visited New Delhi, they'd call Islamabad. There'd be a sense of seeing both countries in the same theatre. And that relationship, I think, also for good reason, is no longer hyphenated. I think it's quite right that we shouldn't only see Pakistan through an India lens and vice versa. And of course, India has now overtaken the UK as the world's 5th largest economy. So it's absolutely right that my government is investing deeply in its relationship with India for economic and other reasons, and has strong relations with both countries. The fourth and last pillar of this relationship I'm describing is the one that hasn't changed. And it involves really the people-to-people links, that diaspora connection that makes our relationship so strong. I have got this far without mentioning cricket. I'm absolutely delighted to talk about cricket. I see glum faces throughout the room. I'm sorry for the score on Sunday, but it was a great match. And it actually was exactly what brought the two countries together. It's a serious point economically. I'll mention China in a moment, but the value of remittances coming into the Pakistan economy from diaspora, of course, is about 30 billion a year. That is largely, I would hazard, what is keeping the Pakistan currency afloat. So those who say, well, of course, Pakistan is awash with Chinese cash, I just don't think it holds up to the comparison of the very interconnected nature, interdependent nature of Pakistan's economy. I could talk more about that relationship. You see me doing it on Twitter, on social media the whole time, but it's absolutely deep and strong. And I do love cricket, but I also talk about it because I think it matters and is a good example of how 1.6 million British Pakistanis, 100,000 Brits here in Pakistan are linked together. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying the relationship between the two countries, the bilateral relationship that I look after is fundamentally changing. So finally, what does that mean for the way ahead against the backdrop that Dr. Megan is describing? And I've got 3 propositions for Pakistan that I think come as conclusions for what I have set out. The first is it is absolutely right to focus on inclusive economic growth. Just about every conversation I have at the minute comes back to the economy. And in a way, Forum A and Forum B should be completely intertwined, in my view. I raise demographics and population growth because if you look at Pakistan's forecasted population growth to 2050, the country needs to create about 1.5 million jobs a year just to keep a steady state and have those who are turning 18 in work. 1.5 million a year, and that's without significantly growing the economy. I think the trade conversation is a vital part of that. You should be coming to countries like mine and demanding a deeper conversation about trade, about investment, how we link into the 5,000 British companies that are in the Gulf. There's only about 200 here in Pakistan. And the trading schemes we have, GSP Plus for Europe, has been replaced for the UK after we left the EU with something called the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, announced in August. Much more attention needed on that because it gives duty-free access to the UK to about 94% of Pakistani goods and services. A massive engine of growth if we can unleash it and get businesses talking. Of course, that won't happen if businesses don't see certainty and stability and a clear a funded economic plan after the floods. The coming donor conference, the conversations with the IMF are, to me, absolutely critical if we are to get through that. I'm confident, but there's a lot of work needed to get through it. So I completely agree with Hina Rabbani Kar when she said earlier that the quintessential goal of Pakistani foreign policy should be the economy. That is absolutely right. Second proposition is invest in human capital and skills. There's a danger after the floods. We talk a lot about concrete. We don't talk about people. The schools that have been affected, the healthcare that's been affected. We've got to make that demographic growth a dividend, not a burden. And my government makes no apology for talking a lot about girls' education. No country can achieve its goals without utilizing 50% of its population. It's good to see the ladies in the room. There are still too many men in suits. Every panel I speak on, we're saved by Dr. Megan here, but if we're not unleashing the power of Pakistan's brilliant female role models, we are not going to change the jobs for the boys culture. So 1 is focus ruthlessly on economic growth, 2 is focus on human capital, and 3 is regional connectivity. And most of the conversations I have on the traditional foreign policy areas, China, CPEC, Afghanistan and India, actually come back to regional connectivity. You're not going to grow this economy unless you've got regional connectivity. It is the least interconnected region in the world. World Bank studies, you can find other ones, a good World Bank study, it's a little bit old now, that reckons you'd put over 20% on Pakistan's GDP over a 10-year period if you opened trade with India. It seems naive, it seems impossible, it seems a pipe dream, but you're not going to meet those jobs in 20, 30 years' time unless you're trading with your region. ASEAN, okay, it's a formal trading bloc. Intra-regional trade is, I think, about 23% last time I looked. In South Asia, it's 2%. 2%. So you have to crack those links through from Afghanistan down from Central Asia, the ability to trade across the border with India, and then, of course, China, finally. I'm in the camp of those who think we should not be seeing a zero-sum choice with China. China's investment in CPEC is infrastructure that Pakistan needs and is good if it's done in the right way, without a heavy debt burden, with good environmental standards, labor standards, and that transfers skills and expertise into the Pakistan economy. So those will be my 3 propositions. In conclusion, I am optimistic, actually, and although we can talk a lot about the challenges, I do see opportunity. To quote Kissinger again, he described diplomacy as the patient accumulation of 1,000 microscopic advantages, and that is often my best definition of what diplomacy, I think, is about. As I say, for the UK, it's a non-discretionary relationship. Even if we lose at the cricket, it's still non-discretionary. And I think I would be with those who says we should avoid blocks. You know, campism is not helpful, and generally the solutions, I know someone will ask me, why is Britain not riding in to sort out Kashmir? And my answer is because the solutions will be Pakistani, they won't be British. My very last point, and I think I said this last time I spoke to this forum, is address perceptions. One of the things internationally that sits with Pakistan are perceptions that I don't think accord with reality. That's perceptions about security, that's perceptions about the economy, and the more people that are traveling here, that's why I've been a champion of trade, and British Airways and Virgin Atlantic direct flights back to the UK. My job as a diplomat is not to be a cheerleader for Pakistan, it's to advance British interests. But everywhere I look, whether it's the cricket team, whether it's the expo in Dubai, shows that we can change those perceptions and unlock a really bright future for Pakistan. Bahut shukriya.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that detailed presentation, and your 3 points are well taken on focusing on inclusive economic growth, investing in human capital, and then, of course, regional connectivity. And that would possibly best help Pakistan to chart out its course in the future international order as well. And since our guest, Ms. Felina Chakarova, requested that she's short in time, we would like to bring her up for her discourse before Dr. Dimitri Trenin. I hope, Dr. Dimitri, you will understand. Ms. Felina Chakarova is the director of the AIES, the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and founder of Face for a Conscious Experience in Vienna, Austria. She conducts strategic foresight and trends analysis for the Austrian Ministry of Defense and instructs at the RWRI. Her work focuses on consultation, lectures, and publications on global and regional trends, future scenarios, and geopolitical topics. Ms. Felina, please go ahead with your presentation on the subject.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be among such distinguished guests. Thank you to the organizers of Margala Dialogue for having me today, and also to Islamabad Policy Research Institute. Now, I would like to start, or let's say to take from where Dr. Sullivan actually stopped, namely to point to several trends based on my strategic foresight analysis. And I would like to also highlight that I'm not representing my government. I have no diplomatic function, nor do I represent any European official positions, but solely my opinions and analysis and assessment as a security and geopolitical analyst. Now, the way how I am looking at the current developments, of course, being a European based in Vienna, for us in the last almost 9 months, the most precarious single development with systemic relevance on the old continent is and has been and remains the full-scale war that Russia launched against Ukraine. And I will base my assessment against this background. So first and foremost, the way I have been analyzing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, starting on February 24th, was mostly in the context of the ongoing global transformational processes. And since there is another European participant, I'm sure that Dr. Massage will also get this topic covered. I will only focus on the global transformational processes. And the way is now being split in 2 major parts, centered around 2 centers of power. The outcome of this process is not known, so nobody can tell what this bifurcation means, but it means for sure, and this is the second important trend, an ongoing systemic decoupling that will actually more or less cover and affect the most relevant socioeconomic network. So that means not only trade, and as we've heard, of course, technology, as we are in the middle of the 4th industrial revolution, and the competition for the power that will be able to ride the wave of the fourth industrial revolution, similar to what happened during the third industrial revolution between the two superpowers, United States and the Soviet Union, and also similar to the way how Great Britain became this global power thanks to the technological breakthroughs from the second and the first industrial revolution. Once again, we are in the middle of this competition. We have these two main competitors. We have some other regional players, among which, of course, also the European Union, lagging behind and trying also to catch up. And yet, of course, the power that will be victorious in this process will also be able, most likely, to impose its own reading and understanding about global norms, rules, and standards of the game. So this also creates a kind of bifurcation. But then again, of course, when we talk about the socioeconomic networks, it's also about the global financial and monetary system, which is also undergoing transition, the global energy system, which, as was already highlighted, is equally witnessing such bifurcational processes. Why? Because on the one hand, we see clearly the, so to say, final decision on decarbonization, but on the other hand, we see also that there is a second block of emerging powers, mostly located in Asia, where this conference is also taking place, and they, of course, envision decarbonization, but certainly not in the same time slot and in the same period. So that means that with the two Asian giants, China and India, being still not only in a regional competition, but also eager to generate further economic growth for their population and for their economic systems, obviously they will be postponing this decarbonization by at least 10 to 20 years. And that, of course, once again creates a kind of dichotomy in the global energy system, as the hunger, the demand for fossil fuels will likely remain to a great extent, next to also the increased demand for minerals and rare earths that will serve the green transition. And in that particular case, as a geopolitical analyst, I argue that we will be witnessing increased number of conflicts, military conflicts, and competition based on the surge of demand for this new, so to say, for the production and for the mining of minerals and rare earths meant for the decarbonization. Now, speaking of the two Asian giants, the third important trend that I see next to the bifurcation and the ongoing decoupling, that in my view may result in a systemic coexistence, but may also result in a more violent decoupling process, given the way how the two, of course, competitors will manage the relationship. And I agree with Dr. Sullivan that as of today, we see some positive signals, but we should be also cautious of the long-term prospects of this bilateral relationship. And this bilateral relationship will be very much also affected by the way how China and India will settle their relationship. And this, of course, is critically important for Pakistan as well. Now, I argue that, unfortunately, and that is the job of geopolitical analysts, to try to reflect on the reality the way it is, and not in normative terms. That means, of course, that it's not my normative vision, but I argue that the military tensions between China and India will increase by the time, given the fact that India is projected to become world's economic power number 3. This will, of course, further increase also the competition between them, and then, of course, given also the competition between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, it will be increasingly difficult for India to oscillate and try to not side that means to enter strategic alliances or defense pacts, as it happened in the past, namely during the Cold War. So the question about non-alignment movements 2.0, probably it will be called differently this time, is raised once again, and it is a very relevant question for us Europeans, since Europe is currently pursuing a kind of a similar approach, specifically in its relations to China, trying, of course, on the one hand to be this strategic partner of the United States, and specifically now that the United States have supported very strongly the European partners by providing all this military aid to Ukraine, for Ukraine to sustain the Russian invasion. And yet, in the long run, of course, Europe may also be confronted with either or choices, similar as India, namely if, as I said, the bifurcation will intensify and the decoupling will deepen. And here, once again, for the short term, I see actually a window of opportunity specifically for the relations between India and Pakistan, namely in the field of trade and economic ties, to kind of normalize the relationship and look for opportunities, given some of the trends that my two previous colleagues have highlighted in terms of demographic, in terms of the demand for jobs, and also in terms of the demand for diversification of supply chains and new transport corridors. And one way how this may happen is namely through Indian facilitated supply chains. We saw now also during the war that Russia was partially successful in launching the transport corridor to India that goes through Central Asia and Iran. One such possibility could be further diversification from a Pakistan's point of view, given the already deepened trade and economic relations with China. So we already heard about the economic corridor that China has built in Pakistan, but I argue that if the tensions increase between Beijing and New Delhi, in fact, Pakistan will be on the winning side if it pursues a kind of normalization. Now, an important fourth trend that I see is linked to the American position. Now, we've observed already the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but I argue that there was also another important American disengagement that happened over the last years, and that was the one linked to West Asia, the previously famously called Middle East, and that, of course, unleashed a series of kind of different actors constellations between the regional actors on the ground. So in the long run, we Europeans, of course, consider a scenario in which America may also decide to withdraw from the old continent, specifically because of its shift towards the Indo-Pacific, where it will be, of course, focusing on the competition with China, and forging new partnerships and alliances. So from that point of view, we, of course, are specifically alarmed, and the European decision makers will have to come up with some sustainable strategies and approaches as to how to strengthen the European pillar within the transatlantic partnership, how to engage America differently. So I argue that in this particular case, institutions will matter next to states, and organizations will matter, because the European Union as an organization has emerged stronger after the pandemic and has actually become even more stronger after the launch of the war. since it has also provided, for the very first time, military aid to a sovereign country in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, Article 51. And these organizations, the European Union, will probably strive for, let's say, relaunch of free trade agreement negotiations with Washington. So I don't see the end of the free trade agreements. On the opposite, the relaunch of the negotiations with India is another example, and this is something that Pakistan will also benefit from. Final point on my side, when it comes to the fifth trend that I see in this period, in this transitionary, highly volatile and insecure period of global affairs, is very much related to the fluid ad hoc geopolitical constellations between the relevant regional powers. We've heard some of the names. That means first, second tier of countries next to the two systemic competitors. And all of them have been and will be navigating between the US and China while trying to avoid taking sides. Now, in the case of Russia, I argue that Russia sided with the one center of power, and that was also relevant for the decision to launch a full-scale war against a sovereign country. So practically, from my point of view, Russia tried to also maximize its gains amid the bifurcation of the global system. In the case of Europe, I argue, will try to postpone the moment of taking a final decision. The current visits of relevant decision makers to China, or also the statements like the proposal of Macron for China to practically mediate between Russia and Ukraine. All of these are signs that Europe does not want to get caught in this binary world, and this is something that is relevant for all the rest of the regional powers. That means they don't want to get caught in a binary world in which they have to take either or choices. Australia is an exemption. Australia decided to enter Security and Defense Pact, and that immediately resulted in a deterioration of the relations with China. And yet I argue that we may also see a third way, countries like the European Union, India, and maybe some others, that will try somehow to remain neutral. And speaking about neutral countries, I'm based in Austria. Austria is a neutral country that is not allowed to enter military alliances, not allowed to send military aid, and not allowed to host military bases. So this kind of phenomenon may also emerge, where powers will seek to somehow create a third credible, let's say, a center of power which does not want to get caught by, as I said, a new systemic conflict. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish much luck to the conference and to all participants.
Thank you so much, Ms. Felina, for your very eloquent discourse. We will now move on to Dr. Dmitry Trenin, who has been waiting for us online. Dr. Trenin is a member of Russia's Foreign and Defense Policy Council. He was the first Russian director of the Carnegie Moscow Center from 2008 to 2022. A former MI colonel, he served for 21 years in the Soviet Army and the RGF, senior research fellow at the NATO Defense College, and fellow at the Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is also an author of over 10 books published in various countries. Dr. Dmitry, you've heard different presentations from our speakers come in. Please share your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to the Margala Dialogue. It's the first time I have the pleasure and honor of taking part in that dialogue. And I thank the Islamabad Policy Research Institute for reaching out to me. I found my good friend Megan O'Sullivan's framework of analysis very useful. And I would want to expand on that by highlighting the geopolitical dimension of the change in the world order. My opening point would be that what we're witnessing is essentially a normal thing. World orders do change, they've always changed, they do not last very long, and the process of change is very disruptive and often violent, and if violent, always tragic. So we're present at the creation, I think, of, or at least at the process of creating a new world order, and that has a price to pay, and a lot of us are paying that price. The bipolar world order during the Cold War lasted 40 years. The unipolar order that a lot of people celebrate today was married to globalization, was married to a huge increase in global economy and global trade and many other things. But that was the order that essentially was based on something that had never happened before, the hegemony of one power, the global hegemony of one power, the United States. And it was that power that underpinned globalization, underpinned the security order in those years and those 2.5 decades. It was the power that established the rules and norms and standards. It was the power that made sure and made clear that those norms and standards be honored, be effective. But everything in this world of international relations is based on the changing balances. And the balance that tilted so far to the United States, so much to the United States at the close of the Cold War, has been moving away from that very unique position. And we have new powers like China, like India, like Turkey, like Pakistan with its nuclear weapons, like Saudi Arabia, like Brazil, and I can go on and on, claiming their own role in this world. And that certainly leads to a change potentially in the world order. That's where we are. The process began, in my view, not 3 years ago, maybe a dozen years ago, with the world financial crisis that exposed the weaknesses of the Washington model of finance and economy. I think it also went through stages. The Ukraine crisis, which did not begin on 24 February 22, but actually in February 2014 with the Maidan in Kiev, with Crimea, with Donbass. That's when the US-Russia standoff turned into more active confrontation. It went through 2020, the pandemic, and the very different effect that the pandemic has made in different parts of the world, and certainly the Ukraine war that we're talking about is another turning point in that process. So I see this as normal, and I think it is leading to not so much the change of the hegemony. It's not that China will supplant the United States as the leading power of the world. What is happening, in my view, is something even more grandiose, if you like. It is for the first time in a half millennium that non-Western parts of the world are claiming a first-tier role in world affairs. In other words, this is the end of the 500-year-long Western dominance in politics, in military power, in technology, and in many other areas. And that is what's happening now. And that will change the face of the world, and that will change the essence of international relations. International relations will no longer be based solely on Western norms and standards and practices. Western norms and standards and practices will remain, but only as part of the package, if you like, that will include other people's norms and practices. So much more diversity to the world. I do not believe, this is my next point, I do not believe that we're witnessing a return to bipolarity now between China and the United States. China is very different from the US. It is not universalist. It's a non-Western power. As a non-Western power, it is not universalist and will not be universalist. China is claiming an important role. It is a world power. It is a superpower in many ways, but it is not going to impose itself on the rest of the world and set the norms for the rest of humanity, as the West has been doing, because that's the essence of the Western of Western political culture. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying what I see as the reality. So China is also interested in keeping the current economic and to a degree a financial order intact, because China's benefited enormously and continues to benefit enormously from the current economic system that exists in the world. Other countries, I don't line up behind China. Again, China is not the kind of a leader that the United States is. The United States' dominance in the world is based on a unique concept of American leadership. You don't have an analogy to that. The Soviet Union tried to do that, but that was a coercive model, and as a coercive model, it didn't have much of a future, and it did not survive the test that it faced at the end of the 20th century. I do not see much, frankly, I do not see much strategic diversity within the West. In fact, what I've seen, particularly in the last couple of years, is the emergence of something I have never seen before. And maybe this is a result of Russia's action in Ukraine. And that is the emergence of a consolidated West. I would even call it the United States of the West, led by the United States of America. There may be some nuances in reaching out to Beijing. These nuances also exist in the United States. There's a fair amount of interest in the United States to continue economic relations with China on America's terms. Europe, particularly Germany, are trying to salvage a relationship with China to serve their own economic interests. That's normal. But what I'm saying is that in strategic terms, when push comes to shove, we're facing the West, which is more consolidated, more solid, more united than it's ever been, more than it was during the Cold War. Even at the height of the Cold War, some leading Western nations, European nations, could afford to have policies at variance with the United States. France, for example, under de Gaulle, or West Germany under Chancellor Brandt with his Ostpolitik. You cannot imagine anything like that today. So that is so much for bipolarity. With regard to Russia's relations with China, yes, in so many ways, China is the one world power that Russia regards as a friend, as a major partner. But there is no alliance relationship between the two of them. Each country, despite the asymmetry between their national power at this time, regards itself as a great power, as independent of the other, or at least as autonomous from the other. Interestingly, this could be compared to China-Soviet Union relations in the 1950s and the 1960s, when China, although it was much smaller economically, militarily, etc., than the Soviet Union, very much insisted that it had a co-equal status as a great power. And that was from day one. That was the point that Mao and Zhou made to Stalin and his friends. One important element in the world order process, world order changing process, has been that a major world power, i.e. Russia, is being excluded from the world order. Some people may say it excludes itself, which is, in my view, a self-serving argument. What Russia is doing with regard to Ukraine in strategic terms is very similar to what the United States was prepared to do with regard to Cuba exactly 60 years ago. There are certain things, there are certain strategic realities that a major power cannot accept, cannot tolerate, and is prepared to go to great lengths. Again, 60 years ago, we were saved by the wisdom of the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union that stepped back from the brink. But with regard to Ukraine, I think we could have avoided this crisis had the United States accepted Russia's need not to have Ukraine in NATO and not to have NATO forces, NATO bases, NATO militaries in Ukraine. That was an offer on the table, even as late as a year ago. The offer was not taken for very clear reasons. That would have been a huge loss in prestige for the United States, having offered NATO membership to Ukraine, even though having no intention, no interest to actually follow up with that offer. It found stepping back a huge political loss and a present to President Putin, which certainly was a non-starter in the American system. But let me conclude by saying this: Russia is not so much let's say, Russia's action in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, is not so much a game changer as a catalyst of the developments that are already on foot. The exclusion of Russia from international economic financial transactions sends a signal to a lot of people in a lot of places around the world that those who crossed the path of the United States might face similar treatment and will face similar treatment. That is a lesson that the Chinese are digesting, but not only the Chinese. It's interesting that a number of other countries are at least thinking about diversifying their currency flows, their currency transactions, moving somewhat away from the dollar. It's not it's not something that's happening on a very large scale. But this is happening. I think that...
Dr. Trenner, given that we're short on time, I would like to interject here. If you could just wrap it up in 30 seconds so we can move on for the next panelist. Thank you so much.
Very good. I want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think my 30 seconds are up.
With Dr. Trennan emphasizing on multipolarity and the weaknesses that existed in the unipolar system, I think I would now push forward the discussion with Brigadier Dr. Rashid Wali Janjua. He is the Director of Research and Analysis at IPRI. He has completed his PhD program in Peace and Conflict Studies from NUST. He has been a regular contributor to op-ed pages of notable dailies, writing on diverse subjects like security, energy, politics, development, human security, economy, and international relations. Sir, please, if you may take the stage.
Thank you very much, my fellow panelists and distinguished audience. His Excellency Turner's discourse got me thinking. Years ago, I had read in one of the inner jackets of Sidney Sheldon novels that it went something like this: forgive me, mate, that we are underlings, that our fate is decided by the cosmic roll of the dice. So when we talk of propositions and we talk of the choices, we need to be cognizant of those trends and forces that are shaping this international order. So I have a structured discourse. You'll have to bear with me for a few minutes. The future international order is being defined by big power competition, digital revolution, and algorithm-driven technology. Kissinger writes that the two competing strains of international relations have kept struggling for ascendancy as the afterglow of post-Westphalian peace. The first strain harked back to the order and equilibrium begotten out of a politico-clerical symbiosis, predating the 30 Years' War in Europe that was challenged by a Protestant alliance. Second was a tendency to disturb that equilibrium. Now, the state interests and sovereignty were the dominant credo of international power politics when the new world order was ushered after the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. British statesman Lord Palmerston has this to say: we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow embodied that credo. The three main reasons that ushered in the modern era of European political and scientific ascendancy included technological advancements, information revolution, and the Protestant Reformation that challenged the tyranny of papacy, ushering in a new era of socio-economic emancipation. The European balance of power concept, however, never fructified in the shape it was practiced in Europe, in the world dominated by United States of America. The United States geopolitical philosophy epitomized its founding fathers' vision and the pioneering settlers' thinking. Governor John Winthrop, while in a ship bound for the settlement of Massachusetts in 1630, had spoken of his vision for the New World as the city on the hill. According to Kissinger, the US notion of foreign policy was not the pursuit of specific interests, but the cultivation of shared interests. Now, this new political evangelism smacked surely of a new white man's burden. Those who shared the American political philosophy had to share their interests. Could you show? Okay, slides. Share those interests, otherwise they were in the opposite camp. A long Cold War and its eventual end confronted the world with the same dilemma that it had faced before the two world wars. Now, the choices for the rest of the world were external balancing through acceptance of a surrogate status to the United States, unless they were ready to countenance the reprisals of the United States super surrogates in different regions. There were some contrarian voices, like for instance Professor Stephen Walt. He gave the concept of offshore balancing based on rapidly deployable task forces and regional alliances instead of boots on the ground and costly armed interventions. The current international order in theory relates to Immanuel Kant's model of perpetual peace. Now, that is the theory part, but in practice, there is still a strong imprint of Hobbesian anarchic world conflating national interests with maximization of national power. Thomas Friedman, a champion of liberal internationalism, wrote about the advantages of globalization. In the world is flat, but the world is not so much flat. It has spikes of inequality. There were detractors like Piketty, who believed that globalization and capitalism in fact create wealth inequality, without which state intervention results in economic stratification and human deprivation. Current tendency of the leading global power, that is the United States of America, to use geopolitical competition as a tool to forestall or delay the rise of China as the global challenger to US-dominated international order, is threatening the equilibrium of global balance of power. Allison calls this the Thucydides trap. Now, while prognosticating a conflict scenario in the context of Sino-US rivalry for global dominance, Allison forgot a very perceptive saying of Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for breakfast daily. Does United States culture of competition square with the Chinese notions of competition? The world must stand up and take note of these differences in cultural approaches to competition. Now, small wonder that in the absence of a moral leviathan, there are models which are being copied by the rest of the world in the shape of populism, xenophobia, ideologues, and we have seen rise of such populists in Argentina, Hungary, Philippines, India, and Brazil. Let's have a look on the Kissinger's conceptualization of the notion of a world order. No world order can be achieved by any country alone. To achieve a genuine world order, its components, while maintaining their own values, need to acquire a second culture that is global, structure, and juridical. A concept that transcends the perspective and ideals of any lone region or nation. At this moment in history, this would be a modernization of the Westphalian system informed by contemporary realities. Now, what are those realities? Coming to those realities, these realities are the common sufferings of the mankind. These are the same sufferings that those 200 delegates got together in 1648 at Westphalia to discuss, and then came up with a prescription for unity and state order. Now, the present day reincarnations of those horrors of 30 years war are the common problems of mankind. What are those common problems? These common problems include climate change, food insecurity, and the rest flashed on the slide. Now, the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres should ring alarm bells, who said while delivering the address in Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 conference, "Science is clear, any hope of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degree means achieving global net zero emissions by 2050, but that 1.5 degree goal is on the life support and the machines are rattling." Right, the issue of nuclear weapons use and proliferation has come in renewed focus despite non-proliferation and arms control realities due to introduction of new high-tech weaponry that include cyberspace, outer space use, artificial intelligence. Now, this has lowered the threshold. Artificial intelligence has made violence very tempting to use. So, this has its own challenges on the new international order. Henry Kissinger, again, the doyen of that policy formulation on international order, says the technology for wars has evolved faster than the political leadership's ability to grasp the strategic and philosophical implications of the machines and algorithms at their disposal. Now here, like the age of faith was replaced by the age of enlightenment, the age of enlightenment nowadays is being replaced by the age of algorithms, where machines are talking to machines and reducing the human involvement. The algorithm-dependent wars with reduced human agency in initiation of the future conflicts bring into sharp relief the need for greater moral and technological control over these weapon systems. So the need for reconceptualization of international humanitarian law and human leadership role is therefore direr than ever before in future conflicts. Now, what are those obstacles to addressing these problems? The two main obstacles to my reckoning are the global power competition and the military-industrial complex. The two feed off one another and are undergirded by neocon ideology and privileges that privileges conflict and competition as currencies of global power instead of trade, connectivity, and economic partnerships. Now let's have a look on this quote by George Kennan, which is so germane even today. Were the Soviet Union to sink tomorrow under the waters of the ocean, the American military-industrial complex would have to remain substantially unchanged until some other adversary could be invented. Anything else would be an unacceptable shock to the American economy. He said this thing some time back, still relevant today. Now, coming quickly to China as a rising power, emerging as the biggest challenge to United States global dominance, with its information revolution fully fructified and its economic appetite unrequited, it is a civilization on the upswing. Would it be wise then to seek a balance of power accommodation with such a rising power, or to enter into a self-enervating contentment bout with it? Should the world not jettison the anachronistic military alliance such as NATO that fuel insecurities and huge economic alliance instead? Now, we quote Kissinger, the world must understand the historically grounded legitimate security concerns of Russia, and even if it entails keeping the Ukraine out of pale of NATO. He came up with a lot of stick for this. He gave this prescription that Ukraine should live with some loss of territory in the larger interest of global peace, but it didn't come to pass. Now, the Chinese forays into the economic realm, evidenced by their global reach, have become a fact of life and an idea whose time has come. Economic alliances like RCEP and connectivity projects like BRI are far more attractive to developing nations than the security-centric alliances like Quad and AUKUS. The trade volume of $615 billion between United States and China is the leaven that binds the two global powers into an economic interdependence. The future of the new world order hinges on that interdependence. In this interdependence lie the seeds of success of the future liberal international order, and it is the responsibility of the United States to save the new world order from a confrontational fate. The weakening of the state-based international system because of the inability of international peace organizations like United Nations to broker peace between existing and emerging global power bodes ill for world peace. What then is the way ahead? To conclude, business as usual will yield history as usual. So the way ahead in this competition-dominated Hobbesian world is a Kantian peace through cooperation, consensus, and co-option, which should be based on the strength of international institutions that promote a just and equitable international order. Ladies and gentlemen, finding that order is the pearl of high price that we all need to chase, and we owe it to 8 billion inhabitants of this planet that we call home. I'll stop here and look forward to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director of Research, for sharing your eloquent discourse. But before we do proceed to the question-answer sessions, we do have with us Dr. Bruno Macês, former Minister of European Affairs, Portugal. Sir, he was formerly a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, the Hudson Institute, and the Renmin University, China. He writes regularly for New Statesman and is author of a series of 4 books. He is presently working on his 5th book, Masters of the Metaverse. He is currently consultant at Flint Global. Sir, if you would like to please take the stage.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Great pleasure to be in Pakistan after 3 years. I was here just before the pandemic started in January 2020, and I think I come back at the end, finally. Let me introduce you, I think, because I never heard the concept anywhere else, to the concept of rules-based disorder. You hear a lot about the rules-based order, and perhaps we think that the alternative to the rules-based order is just disorder, but I think a better alternative, and one that describes our world today, is the rules-based disorder. Let me start with the war in Ukraine, because I think it's a good introduction into the concept and into the challenges that we face. How do I see the war in Ukraine? Well, it's, to my view, not very complicated. It's a classical war of colonial aggression, of imperialist aggression, where a large country tries to absorb a smaller neighbor. Didn't start last February, didn't start in 2014, didn't start in 1991, didn't start in 1917. It started centuries ago. The war Russia against Ukraine started centuries ago. Perhaps trace it back to the 17th century, where an idea of Ukrainian nationality is already very powerful. And you've all heard the stories about the Holodomor, the imposed famine on Ukrainians, which was very much directed at destroying Ukrainian resistance. But then we have to ask a second question. Why does a war of colonial aggression, a classical war of imperialism, happen in 2022? Shouldn't it be over? Haven't we closed that chapter long ago? Haven't we, for example, closed that chapter in 1947? And that takes me to my point, that the order created in 1947, and I think you've noticed that I advisedly say 1947 and 1945, because I think 1947 is a much more important date to describe what I'm talking about here. The order created in 1947 is in crisis. We all know that. It's in crisis because there is now a sense among many states that those who created that order and the ideas according to which it was created and the dynamics that sustained it are all much weaker, and something new can emerge. And very clearly in Moscow, the conclusion was something new will emerge, and why not bring back the order of the 18th century, the 19th century in Europe, an order of imperial power, imperial aggression, but also an order where states can grow according to their vitality. As President Putin said in Valdai in November last year, and I was present there, he said, some states have passionarity, they have will to power, and they should expand over their neighborhoods. Other states have reached the end of their lives as states, and they should disappear. This, and I was sitting there in the audience, just as you are, is listening to it and thinking, we're going to have a war in Ukraine. And here is the intellectual, political program of that war, passionarity, which Putin takes from the writer Lev Gumilev. Passionarity is the ideology behind this war, and so it happened over the past 7 months, 8 months. We've seen that. We've seen how President Putin has insisted that this war has nothing to do with NATO. He keeps saying it. This war is a war about Ukraine. Ukraine does not exist as a country. And then he adds, in a touch that will remind everyone of the history of empire, also in this part of the world, he adds, we created Ukraine. Ukraine did not exist before Russia. We created it, and so we have the right to dispose of it as we see fit. Why has this order come to an end? In Valdai, Putin explained that he now thinks the West is too weak to sustain the order as it exists, and something new will emerge. And here is Russia's proposition. a return to the 19th century, to the 18th century. It's not been very successful so far. And I think it's understandable why it hasn't been successful so far. There aren't many countries in the world that want to return to European imperialism. And in fact, if you look around the world today, there's only been one country that has offered material support to Russia. That's quite extraordinary. In a list of about 200 countries, it's only been Iran that has offered material support to Russia for reasons that we can understand. So what is interesting is that there's no appetite to a return to European imperialism. You could make a comparison to the Islamic State. The Islamic State, its ideologues, were also convinced that the world order as it existed in the recent past was coming to an end, and that perhaps this was an opportunity to bring back an Islamic State. But again, we saw very little support for the Islamic State around the world, just as we see very little support for Russia's imperial project. And make no mistake, the reason Russia is failing in Ukraine is that it really has no support around the world for this project. But it still raises an interesting question. Is Putin right that the existing order is coming to an end? He could be right about that, and many people say it. I think many people today have said it, and I'm going to say a version of that. The existing order could be coming to an end, to be replaced by something new, not by the 19th century. It's typical in history, in moments of transition, that many people are trying to bring the past back and others are trying to move into the future. Putin is trying to bring the past back, and good luck to him, but many others are trying to bring a new order into being, and that's a much more interesting project to discuss. But there is no doubt, looking around the world, that the existing order is in crisis. The reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as I've just said, demonstrates that there is no support for Putin's project. But we've seen in Afghanistan last year that there is also very little support for the existing order. And there is very little support for the existing order in this part of the world, I know very well. We look around the world, we see that the power of Europe and the United States is much diminished. We are not going back to those centuries. Putin is wrong. GDP tells its own story. The United States used to have 51% of GDP after the Second World War. Now that's down to 25 and going down. It's not even about China, because these dynamics are so global that whether China slows down or not, the United States will come down to below 20% of global GDP. And when it's below 20% of global GDP, there is no doubt that the transformations are profound and they have to be taken into account. As Minister Carr said today, we are going through a process of transformation, and it would just be wonderful if we could go through that process without war, because we're going to get to the end of the process one way or another. And why not try to get to the end of the process without conflict and without war, rather than get to the same outcome, as she said, but through war and through conflict. The world as we have it today is a world where the rules are not given. Rules-based disorder. As we just saw in the case of Russia, it's not that we live in a world without rules. Rules are being improvised, they are being changed. Europe and the United States have changed many rules that were considered to be sacred over the past few months. Central bank reserves are supposed to be untouchable. They were quickly seized, and I personally defend they should be confiscated. So many rules have been changed. The rules are open for grabs, and the process we have is a process where main state actors are trying to define new rules. A rules-based disorder where some have the ability to shape the rules and others have no such ability. That, I'm afraid to say, I don't think is going to change. It's still a hierarchical system, and what we see today is there is a very limited number of political states, of state actors that have the ability to shape the rules of the future. It's essentially a game between China and the United States, with some role to play for the European Union in shaping rules about the economy, about trade, about technology. We'll see whether India is capable of doing that in the future. We'll see if other countries can play a role. When it's a question of shaping specific rules to which a country is committed, even medium-sized powers have a role in shaping those rules. What do smaller countries do? Well, smaller countries actually play a very interesting game in this new rules-based disorder. They can do two things. They can side with one of the major players if they like the project, the rules project that this state player has more than the alternatives. But they can also get better at playing according to different rules. They know that the rules can change. If they are flexible enough, if they're nimble enough, they can adapt to new rules. And they can be very good at playing it according to different set of rules and adapting. I mean, a country that comes to mind is Singapore. Singapore gives the impression that they could play under the current system and be winners, but if the system changes tomorrow, they will be able to adapt. So small countries, even if they're not able to rise to the level of those who are shaping the rules, they can still be a winner playing under different sets of rules. What has happened fundamentally? I'll conclude with some thoughts on that. As I see it, that's the topic of my next book. This is a story about technology. Where does the story of European and American hegemony come over the past 5 centuries? Well, it was essentially a story of those who arrived first at some new technologies, modern technologies. Were able to master those technologies before everyone else, and we were able to keep control over these technologies for some time. But it's in the nature of knowledge, it's in the nature of technology that eventually it spreads out. Eventually it becomes diffuse. And I think we're seeing that very clearly in our time, where controls over the flow of knowledge are becoming more and more difficult, and knowledge is becoming, technological knowledge is being universalized in a way that I think is the main factor explaining why you no longer have a single central power, you have many centers of power because technological knowledge is being developed in different parts of the world. But technology brings a second very interesting novelty to the world order. Rules-based disorder, because the rules are always changing, being created, and there are different projects of what the rules should be, and a very intense competition to shape the rules of the future. This makes geopolitical competition very intense indeed. Why? Because whoever succeeds in building this new world of the future will be able to control it, will be able to have access to backdoors, will be able to have access to the control panels of the global system, will be able to have what computer programmers call root access to the system, will be able to change the rules when it's convenient. And we saw how Europeans and Americans did that. So the world of the future, this technological world of the future, is a world where the stakes are extremely high. Whoever is able to build it will live in a world of its own making. Whoever is not able to build it will live in a world made by others. Remember how American officials around 2018 started repeating that the stakes are very high because China wants to build the world of the future, and if we're not careful, we'll have to live in a Chinese world. This is really the challenge of our time, that the world, instead of being the natural world, or God's world, a world given by nature, given by God, the geopolitical world of the future looks increasingly like it could be a Chinese world or an American world or perhaps some other alternative. And the stakes of this game are essentially the stakes about what kind of world we want to live in. It's not surprising that geopolitics has become so central to our lives. But geopolitics is no longer about controlling physical territory. Geopolitics is about building virtual territory. It's about computer networks. It's about 5G networks. It's about artificial intelligence. It's about who has access to the magic levers of technological power. And we know what those magical levers come down to in many respects, super chips and microchips. Not surprised that global competition is so much about that. Rules-based disorder, I'll conclude. We shouldn't lose hope because there are rules, but let us remain aware that the game is in fact existential. It's about defining the rules of tomorrow, defining the rules of the game we're going to live under. Hierarchy has disappeared. The West is increasingly no longer at the top. There are many players at the top. And this brings the threat of conflict almost immediately, because a world that has no hierarchy, a world that has no global leading system of thinking, a world where people disagree about the most fundamental principles, is a world where conflict is almost inevitable, lives at the surface, and where the challenges and the stakes could not be higher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruno, for your discourse and where we're headed in terms of the world we'll be living in. And now moving on to our last speaker of the day, I will also like to thank our audience for staying put and listening to us. We have online joining us from China, Dr. Shen Dingli, Professor International Affairs from Fudan University. He is the founder and director of China's first non-government-based program on arms control and regional security at Fudan University. His research areas cover nuclear arms control and disarmament, regional non-proliferation issues concerning South Asia, Northeast Asia, and Middle East, as well as China's foreign and defense policies. Thank you, Dr. Shen, for staying with us till the end of this, and I will now let you share your discourse.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this event. As the last panelist of this session, I tried to be brief, as this session has already lasted for some 2 hours. I would say the current world order doesn't seem to give any major power of the world a sense of security. Russia feels threatened with NATO eastern expansion. And Russia communicated this concern to the United States, but it failed. In Russia-US summit in Geneva last year, of course, I don't think the so-called Russian special military operation in Ukraine is a rightful response to NATO expansion. But the constant expansion till Russia's backdoor really does not make Russia feels secure. China does not feel the US military presence in Japan, in Australia, in South Korea makes China secure. America may have a reason that Japan deserves its legitimate security, and Japan has a right to invite America to deploy its force on the territory of Japan. And this argument can apply to Republic of Korea, especially when it perceives threat from the northern side. But because China has a major difference with the United States regarding the status of Taiwan, and the United Nations does not think Taiwan a sovereign state. And on this basis, the government in Beijing has replaced Taiwan to be the sole legitimate government of entire China, Taiwan included. And then China understands that it is based on this understanding, China-US normalized their relationship. But the US seems to have a different understanding of this. US does not think Taiwan as a sovereign country. And, but the US may have not accepted that the China's sovereignty extends to Taiwan. US may understand China's position, And the U.S. may not object to China's position, but the U.S. may have never clearly accepted China's position. And with such a nuance, China, U.S. has not made their huge difference to be developed into a form of a warfare. And China aspires to challenge this status quo, this current world order, that the U.S. can impose its will upon China, so China would not deserve its legitimate right to attain its national unification across the Taiwan Strait at China's disposal. China cannot buy this, and China considers that such American dominant world order is against China's interest. And someday, China would change it. And China feels the U.S. military presence in China's neighborhood as a physical threat. And the U.S. feels that China's intent and ever-growing capacity to be potentially able to change the status quo, the current world order, or the order in East Asia, constitutes a threat to America, or the current world order. And for this, U.S. does not feel secure. And American response that it's the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would visit Taiwan in the name of a private visit, but actually addressing Taiwan as a country, and to be escorted by the U.S. Air Force. Does not seem to be perceived by Beijing as a harmonious, friendly gesture. So China wants to change it. If such a current world order would continue, then the possible next U.S. House Speaker, the leader of the Republican Party in the House, Kevin McCarthy, may also visit Taiwan. And this world order shall not continue. And Americans' imposition of the will and interest upon China makes China feel insecure. And China's interest to challenge this, this kind of unfair world order makes American feel threatened. So Russia feels American-led NATO's eastern expansion of the NATO makes Moscow feels threatened. But the American feels that Russia's so-called special operation in Ukraine not only has threatened Ukraine, but also the entire European neighborhood, for which American and the NATO member family need to respond. China feels insecure, US feels insecure, Russia feels insecure, and American feels insecure. What a mess. This current world order makes nobody feel secure. And the previous speaker has mentioned world disorder. I would even say there may have no order at all, because when the UN Charter was drafted and adopted, no one would ever perceive a scenario in which a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which possesses nuclear weapon, would venture to launch a military action against its neighbor. And when Security Council would discuss this, that country would veto. Despite 13 countries would be against, would support the draft resolution. which would criticize such a performance. But the one which launched such a performance would veto. And Security Council is the only platform for the world body to address a major security problem, challenge, and to discuss how to respond. But it has not imagined a country that can veto, that can help make the world secure and peaceful, would venture to make many countries to feel concerned. And so far, the issue of revising to revise UN Charter to make any such repetition of such event not to be not to happen in the future has not been discussed. The UN has been paralyzed. Therefore, the world has no order at all how to handle such a phenomenon. So we see lots of order may have been challenged, and we still have not established certain necessary order. Then, how to discuss the future of the world?
Thank you, Dr. Shen. If you could kindly wrap your discourse in a minute, that would be great, since we're already running out of time. We've practically run out of time.
Thank you very much. But that's a bit unfair. You have not told every member of this session this way. I tried to be brief. So we see President Xi Jinping and President Biden have addressed how they should work together despite their vast differences. They should work together to address Korean Peninsula nuclear development, to address how to handle food security, pandemic security, and global public health. And they try to continue such a dialogue as Secretary of State Mr. Blinken is going to visit Beijing. So this possibly would slow the speed of the declining China-US relationship. This gives a little comfort of the world at large. I'm still kind of pessimistic to see how we can make the necessary order and how to make all major stakeholders and all countries in the world to observe the global order. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shen, for staying with us till the last minute and also sharing with us the Chinese perspective of what the global world order could look like. And before we move on to dinner, we do have 3 slots open for Q&A. So interested people, I would urge you to keep your questions short, and Director Research, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, will be taking these questions.
You had a question? So we'll take 3 questions and then answer together. Do you have a mic? Okay.
I am Professor Amna, Professor of Political Science. I have a question to the British High Commissioner. Sir, you have mentioned very valid points that we should increase in regional trade and connectivity, and especially improving our relations with our neighbor, eastern neighbor. So what would be the probability of doing that, keeping the response of India always demonizing all efforts by Pakistan? Thank you.
Yes. On the right, please. Please be brief and just ask questions, huh? No statements. Thanks.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shafkat. I am MPhil Scholar of International Relations from Islamic University. A multi-competition between Russia and US and economical competition between China and US. Russia is a superpower in military. Russia has huge losses in Ukraine war. So my question is that Russia-Ukraine war, what is impact on global order, and what is the lesson for China to not attack on Taiwan? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, in the third row.
Hello. Hi. My name is Mohammad Samad Zia. I'm a senior research fellow at the Army Institute of Military History. My question is for Excellencies British High Commissioner and Minister Bruno, please. Not to be pointing fingers at anyone, but do you reckon there's a duality when we look at the international system, how we see Russia as a revisionist state, but we don't look at India the same way when India claims that it has the ability and it will invade Gilgit-Baltistan? And this one is particularly for the High Commissioner, please. Excellency, you've mentioned that the UK is already facing a budget deficit and there are economic issues. Obviously, Pakistan's only about 0.6% contributor when it comes to carbon emissions. Doesn't the developed world have a responsibility towards Pakistan? It's in a way that it actually helps Pakistan rather than just rhetoric that we've been hearing that the world is going through an economic crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. So quickly. This will be the last question of the round and then we'll answer.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I am Zuhaib. I have very short 3 questions. First, how Great Powers can help to develop the developing nations when they are busy and struggling for their own interest and hegemonic designs? My second question is, don't you think the Western powers, especially UK, US and France, are not taking serious steps to stop Russia-Ukraine war through tabletop? And my last question is, most of the developing countries are fueling the industry of the developed countries through providing them hydrocarbons, while they are not industrializing themselves. Thank you very much.
So, Your Excellency would like to start first? First question was addressed to you about...
Thank you very much. Let me address the 2 questions for me. I don't want to hog the space. I'm sure Bruno will answer and others eloquently. Professor Amna, you know, my proposition was about strategic interest. It wasn't the tactical ease or otherwise of getting there. And I think I acknowledged it, sort of sitting here now, it seems a very, very long way away to achieve that goal. But the job of us as international affairs practitioners, as diplomats, is to find those pathways. And that needs dialogue, that needs lines of communication, that needs embassies appointed in capitals. Those things aren't in place. The first challenge is to start the de-escalation of the path towards that. So I'm not saying it looks easy, but I'm saying it is in Pakistan's, and I would argue India's national interest to reach that path. I think there were 2 other questions, one from Mohammed Saab and I think Suhaib at the end, on this sense of post-floods, the developed world's responsibility. My point is I recognize that responsibility both, if you like, intellectually. I mean, I think it is irrefutable that the emissions that have been emitted were from developed countries, and that is causing the damage we've seen here. And actually morally, I think there is a case to answer. But my point is that argument alone is not enough. If we just go around talking of climate reparations, I mean, there's a very important bit of negotiations that is on the agenda in Sharm on loss and damage, but that alone is not enough. Many would say that Pakistan needs to get its own economic house in order if we are to build the kind of partnership with humility to help economies like this, developing countries, adapt, build the resilient infrastructure and the human capital necessary to deal with a world with many more climate disasters to come. So if we just have a sort of owing narrative, I don't think it's going to be enough. Thank you.
Right, Bruno?
Yes. So, you know, when I look at the Ukraine war, I see basically a war between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's misguided to bring in many other factors, because from the Russian side, if you read Putin's speeches, it's all about Ukraine. He's obsessed about Ukraine, and he has argued that it needs to disappear. I think this has shocked many people. Now, you may say it's not the first time we see a genocide. And I would agree with you, it's not the first time. In fact, I would argue that every colonial imperial project has very strong genocidal tendencies with it. All I would say is, yes, genocide is a constant of human history, but we have to deal with this one now. We have to deal with this genocidal project now. This is the one where our own obligations towards the future lie. For all the sorrow that past examples where we didn't live up to that is also there. Consequences for the old order, well, a great shock. You know, as I argue in my remarks, to some extent the old order was holding on based on convention. So that's correct, and this has been a shock. It's been a shock to our moral understanding. People in Europe are still shocked after 9 months that a war of genocide can happen in Europe again. Forced us to think everything anew. And globally, an economy that was already in crisis, a huge shock to commodities and to energy. But again, I would call your attention that everyone is suffering from this. Everyone is together in this, and I think that's part of the reason that really no country has offered support to Russia, because you see in this part of the world, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, how much these countries are suffering from Russia's invasion.
The question about duality, I'd like to take on. So, I'll quickly answer the question. Yes, there is a duality, and that is a reflection of the skewed international political system, and that can only be addressed if that system is based on Kantian model of peace, and for that the rules also have to be amended, and the institutions which are meant to underline those rules, yet United Nations, General Assembly maybe needs to be more democratized, more strengthened, but those nations, P5, are not going to give this thing away, because it's a very raw reflection of international politics. And as Ellison tells us that Thucydides' trap, there were 16 case studies of a rising power challenging a hegemon, a global dominant hegemon, and out of those 16 case studies, in case of 12 there was a conflict. So we should look to the 4 case studies very carefully and try and craft an international political system that is predicated upon those rules that are amenable to human security, and international law perhaps needs to be recrafted after a dialogue and debate, just like it happened after World War II. So that's the only way to go ahead, and that was the pearl of high price that we needed to chase in this discourse. So thank you. Sir, why not? It's a pleasure. Why not, sir?
Please, sir.
I found the observations extremely stimulating. Thank you very much. But I just want to question whether it is fair to say that Ukraine comes after 1947, even though, Minister, you were extremely thought-provoking. What about the Balkans? Europe decided to forget what happened to Serbia, Bosnia. What happened? Europe failed in the 90s.
You're so eloquent, we would like you to speak in the mic.
And it took the United States to help restore some sanity to Europe. So Ukraine is not the first time Europe failed. Europe failed earlier as well.
You are correct. I mean, being European at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, let me tell you, is not easy, because we have all these high principles and high values, and we many times feel completely powerless to do anything. Europe is, in that respect, the agreement was that Europe will never again have military power of significance. And now we have to live with that burden as well. And in many cases, that burden turns into moral guilt. And grow up my age, the moral guilt of what happened in the Balkans is with all of us, I can tell you that.
I would add, Janju Asab, it's a good challenge. It goes to the duality question, which I ducked. And I hope all my remarks are predicated with a degree of humility, because this new order disorder that Bruno has given us that we're groping towards has to start with a sense of partnership that is a partnership of equals, with due respect for different positions and for each other's sovereignty. But behind your question, sir, and behind the question on duality is, if you will allow me, something that I call whataboutery. And whataboutery, in the end, takes us down, I think, a bit of a dead end. Because just because there was, I would agree completely, a failure over the Balkans, it can be argued, a question mark about, say, the Libyan intervention, certainly the Iraq intervention, I don't think that means that we shouldn't be taking the positions that some of us have advocated on Russia-Ukraine. So, you know, it is very easy to point to many other conflicts and areas of global trouble where the system has failed, is failing, and may yet fail. But just because there is a broken window over there does not mean I should be worried about the broken chair over here. I'm not saying that's what you were arguing, but it allowed me to address the point on duality. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists, and especially our audience, for staying with us till the end of this session. I would now like to request President Ipri to kindly come up on stage and present mementos to our esteemed panelists that are present here. Dr. Bruno, please receive your memento. Dr. Bruno. His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Kristen Turner, please. And last but not the least, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, kindly receive your shield. With the sessions finally concluded, I would like to make the happiest announcement of the day, that is, dinner is served, and we may be heading towards that. But I would also like to inform everyone that after dinner we do have a musical performance in store for you, so we hope to see you for that as well. Thank you so much.